Hey there guys, welcome back for another video. Now in today's video, we're gonna travel back in time a little bit. Picture this, the year is 2020 and we're right in the middle of a global pandemic, which means that I can't go anywhere and I can't really do anything and I'm really bored. So I had to find a way that I could sort of keep myself entertained while being stuck at home. And I sort of just dove into building things like crazy. I built so many things for this house during that time. I tackled so many different woodworking projects, and after a while I sort of decided that it might be fun to try and document some of these things. Initially I just kind of wanted to do it for myself, but after some encouragement from friends and family, I decided to start this YouTube channel in I think like December of 2021. So once I started my YouTube channel, I was always sort of looking for ideas of things that I could build and film. And so my mother-in-law came to me in December of 2021 and told me that I should make a tailor's clapper and do a video on it. Now I'll be honest, when she came to me and asked me to build that, I had no idea what a tailor's clapper was. So I had to do a little bit of research, and once I did, I decided that this would be a pretty simple thing to build, and I thought it would make a good video. Little did I know at that time just how popular these tailor's clappers are in the quilting and sewing community. And actually, that video from back in December of 2021 has gone on to be the second most viewed video on my channel. So it turns out these tailor's clappers are pretty popular, I guess. So you may be wondering, why exactly am I making another video about this tailor's clapper? And well, a lot has changed in the last 3 years. I've got better filming equipment now, better tools, and most importantly, I've got better skills and a better understanding of how exactly this tool works and how to make it. I think I've really been able to refine the process of how to make this thing and choosing the right type of wood that works best for this, and I'll explain all of that in this video. Since that first video aired in December of 2021, I've probably made close to 50 of these tailor's clappers now, so I think I have a pretty good idea of what it takes to make one of these things. All right, sit back, relax, let me show you how I did it. Okay, real quick before we start building one of these things, we should probably get a better understanding of the history of this tool and how to use it. So these tailor's clappers were designed about 120 years ago in England by a tailor. And their main purpose was for getting really flat seams when it came to making things like pants and dresses. Now, the way these things work, and you'll have to excuse my poor demonstration here, I'm not a quilter or a sewer, so the best I can do to demonstrate a seam is with some shop towels. So let's say you were to iron a seam with some steam on your iron. Now, when you were ironing, that seam would just be released into the air, and so that is not the best way to get a flat seam. So instead of releasing all of that steam into the air, one of the main purposes of the tailor's clapper is that once you iron it with your steam here, you would then just press this tailor's clapper down onto that steam. These words are way too close to one another. You would press it onto that seam. And what that'll do is, instead of releasing all of that steam into the air, it's going to trap the steam into the wood itself. So all of that steam will essentially just get trapped into the wood. Now, it's very important that you use a close grain hardwood for this tool, because you want as much of that steam to be trapped into the wood itself rather than releasing it into the air. So by trapping it all in here and then pressing it down onto that seam, you can clap it. I've seen most people just seem to just set it on there, and that will transfer a lot of that steam into that seam, and then it will keep it really flat. Now, as I mentioned, one of the most important factors for this is using a hardwood, using a close grain wood, and that just means that, like I said, the grain is really tight. It's not going to allow a lot of that steam to escape, and it's going to hold it all in the wood itself. So I have found that maple is generally the best wood that you can use for these tailor's clappers. I've used walnuts, I've even used oak in that previous video, but the very best, in my opinion, that you can probably use for this particular tool is going to be maple. Now, it's also important that it's got some weight to it. That way, when you're pressing on that seam, that weight is also contributing to that flat seam, getting that very flat seam. So something about 2 to 3 inches should give you the weight that you need for something like this. As far as length goes, I can't remember the exact length I made this, but I want to say it's probably between 12 and 15 inches long, and then maybe like 3.5, 2.5, 3, I'm not sure. You can kind of make that whatever you want. I also added in some finger holds here on the side just to make it a little bit more comfortable to hold. All right, now that we have a better understanding of how these things sort of came about and how they work, let's make one.
Now I'll be making a batch of these clappers out of a 2.5 inch slab of maple. So the first thing I have to do is break this slab down into smaller pieces so that I can begin milling them. Next, I started running these boards through the planer to get them good and flat into the thickness I was after. Now, my goal was to keep these boards as thick as possible so that they would have some weight to them. Next, I ran each of these pieces through my table saw on this little joiner jig that I made to give me one straight edge. Now, if you want to see how I made this little jig, then I'll leave a link to that video below. Once I had one straight edge, I then set my table saw fence 3 inches from the blade. And I placed that straight edge against my fence and started ripping. Now, I made my clappers 3 inches wide here, but you can sort of make them whatever size is most comfortable for you. Then it was off to the miter saw to get them cut to their exact lengths. Now, I started by squaring up one side and then cutting them to length. I cut each of my clappers to 12 inches long, but again, this particular dimension can be adjusted to your liking. Next, I marked the center of my clapper on both ends. Then I just took a little lid with a round profile and used that to trace a rounded edge on both sides. Now, you can use something more exact here for these rounded edges, but I've found that this little lid works just as well. You could also make the clapper larger on one end and smaller on the other if you'd like. The design for these things is really up to you. I just chose to go with a very simple design here. Then I took my clapper over to my bandsaw and I started to cut out my shape following those lines that I traced earlier. Now, if you don't happen to have a bandsaw, you can also cut this out easily with something like a jigsaw. I made sure to cut just outside of my traced lines here, and I will take care of getting the clappers to their final shape in the next step. Now, I'm using this oscillating rigid sander to help me get these clappers to their final shape on each end. This tool just helps me save a lot of time for stuff like this when I'm making a bunch of these things at once, but you could also use something like a random orbital sander for this step. Now it's time to add those finger holds to these clappers for a more comfortable grip. To do that, I'm using my router table with a 1 1/8 inch bowl and tray bit installed. To keep consistent spacing, I just used some double-sided tape to attach some blocks to my router table that would tell me where to start and stop the cut. Then I just took things really slow as I cut out a groove on one side, turned the router off and waited for it to come to a complete stop, then flipped the piece over and repeated the process for the other side. Now, if you don't have a router table, you can also do this step with a handheld plunge router or omit this step completely. This is more of an optional step just to help improve the overall comfort of using this tool, but the finger holds are not actually necessary. However, I do think they are a nice touch. Next, I'll run over all of the edges of the clapper with my router and a 1/8 inch roundover bit. This just takes away those sharp edges and makes the tool smoother to the touch. Now, if you don't have a router, you could also simply break those sharp edges with something like your sander or good old-fashioned elbow grease and sandpaper. Now it's time for the most tedious part of this project, and that's sanding these clappers. I'm going to start by sanding those finger holds first, and to do that, I've added this new tool to my arsenal. It does a great job of sanding odd shapes and small spaces really well, and considering I have a lot of these to sand, I'm happy to have it. But before getting this tool, I simply sanded all of the finger holds on the clappers by hand. Once I had those finger holds sanded, then I could sand the rest of the clapper with my random orbital sander. I started sanding at 120 grit and eventually worked my way up to 320 grit. Now, prior to my final sanding at 320 grit, I like to do something called water popping. To do that, I just take a wet rag and I wipe it over the clapper on both sides and let it fully dry. That moisture causes some of those wood fibers to rise. Then, once I make my final pass with my sander, I'm essentially sanding down those raised wood fibers. That way, if this clapper comes in contact with moisture, which it probably will from the steam of the iron, then those wood fibers are not as likely to rise again, meaning that this clapper should stay nice and smooth to the touch.
Alright guys, so I've got this thing fully sanded now, and now it's time to move on to the next step, which is putting finish on this thing. That's where things get a bit weird because I'm not gonna put any finish on this thing. And I know, that goes against like everything I've been taught as a woodworker over the last couple of years. You know, they always say, make sure you put the best finish on, put layer after layer so that it can, you know, outlive like your great-grandchildren. But that's not the case with this tool. And the reason we don't want to put a finish on this thing is actually for two reasons. The first reason is that if you remember back to earlier on in this video where I sort of just explained how this tool works, and I told you that its whole purpose is to basically absorb all of that steam from the iron. Well, if I go and put a bunch of finish on this, then how's that steam gonna be absorbed into this wooden piece? That finish is just gonna seal off this wood and not allow any of that steam to be absorbed into the wood itself. So that's one of the main reasons that you don't wanna put finish on this. The second reason is if you put finish on this, some of that finish could potentially leach over into whatever fabric that you're using this on over time. So it's generally best just to leave this wood completely raw, which I gotta be honest, always feels a little weird to me when I get to this step. But on the bright side, it means that I can skip like an entire step and call this thing done. Well, now that I've got these clappers done, I want to test it out a little bit and put this tool to work. Now, my mother-in-law was nice enough to give me some fabric with a seam here so that I can test this tool out. Now, remember, like I said earlier, guys, I am not a quilter or sewer, so if I happen to mess this process up a little bit, that's to be expected. But I'm gonna do my best to see if I can get a really flat seam using this clapper. All right, so if I was to just iron the seam here, got all that steam. Oh, I do remember she told me to flip this portion over, I think. How do I do that? So that's already looking pretty flat. But now we'd want to put this, actually I'll put that there, try to hold a lot of that steam in place. So that is a crisp seam. That seemed to work pretty good for this section here. So now let me do this section down here. Voila. We've got a very nice flat seam. Not bad for an amateur. All right, guys, that's gonna wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed watching me tackle what I'm referring to as Tailor's Clapper version 2.0. And who knows, maybe there'll be a version 3.0 one day. We'll see. If you guys enjoyed watching this video, one super simple thing that you guys can do that really helps me out is just give this video a like. It's something easy you guys can do on your end, and it really helps my channel grow, and I appreciate it. Also, if you happen to be in the market for one of these Tailor's clappers, well, then you're in luck, because as you can see, I have an entire stack of them sitting in front of me, and every single one of these Tailor's clappers is going up for sale on my website at rustydogandco.com. I'll leave that website link below so you can go and check it out. If you purchase one of these things, it's a great way to support me and this channel, and you'll be adding a really awesome tool to your sewing room. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.